Welcome to this special bonus episode of the PhiusCon podcast. I'm Zach Semke, Director of PhiusCon Accelerator, and we're pleased to be sharing a series of bonus episodes recorded at PhiusCon 2022 in Chicago. These interviews were made possible by generous support from Corp and Zola Windows. In this interview, PhiusCon Accelerator's Director of Publications, Mary James, interviews Lois Vitt of Wight & Company. Enjoy.
Lois Vitt.
And you're a Senior VP Chief Sustainability Officer with Wight & Company.
Yep.
And which is based here in Chicago, right?
It is.
And so you came to the PhiusCon conference. You're going to be a keynote speaker. You're doing the closing plenary keynote.
Yes, I am.
Want to give just a little taste of what you're going to be talking about there?
Well, I'm in really esteemed company with Laura Nettleson and Katrin Klingenberg and Gabriella Martin. And I think together we're really going to talk about the imperative for us to continue holding the torch for really aggressive strategies to try and sort of conquer this issue of climate change and, reducing the worst impacts of it, built on a foundation of our careers. Because I think at least Laura and I and Gabriella, if you added up all of the years that we've worked in this industry, we have contributed to the changes that have been promulgated that have led to this moment in I think we're at a high point on the wave. I've been working since 1988 in this field, and I think for years I felt that was I going anywhere? Couldn't see the horizon. Mm-hmm. I think because of technologies and because of a lot of perseverance and stubbornness to maintain direction and trajectory, that there have been amazing advancements forward. And so part of why I'm presenting at this closing is because I really want people who are up to their boots in this industry to know that perseverance coupled with optimism and intelligence are really required for us to go where we need to go.
Absolutely. I mean, and it is easy to sometimes feel like the progress is, one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one step back. So it's great to have a perspective that we are actually moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember distinctly in my career thinking there was no way we would be able to do a net zero energy building, right? It just wasn't a possibility. I remember the early days when I got to put my first solar on buildings, back in the early 2000s, and it was $8 to $10 a watt installed, and it was more like jewelry on a building. We were lucky if it offset the lighting package on the building, right? And now to be able to say on an annual basis it can offset all of the energy is a marvelous thing. And it has to do with people being willing to be early adopters. It has to do with being part of a network and a community that you don't think ever about being in isolation in terms of your career, but really you're part of a community. And how do you be part of a positive kind of like water torture? You can't ever turn it off, right? You have to continue that incredible energy for momentum, to create the momentum. But then when you do, being able to look back over your shoulder and say, wow, we've come a long way. We have a long way to go, but we wouldn't be here if there weren't many of people in my community who, like me, have been doggedly moving forward one project at a time.
So prefer to think of it as kind of tidal forces rather than motor torture, but okay.
It depends on who the audience is.
Right, I guess
Sometimes
so.
they think it's tidal, and other times they think it's torture. You try and do it with a smile.
I'd rather have this surfing analogy. But anyway, how did you get interested in sustainability? Like, what first brought you in that direction?
Well, all the way back in my architecture days, my favorite project in school was a passive design.
Really?
In school, yeah.
That's exciting.
And it was, yeah.
And how did you think about doing a passive design? Or
Well,
was your
it was honestly, I still remember the project. It was to design a monastery, and the monastery had certain rhythms during the day, and I remember designing the building like a clock that was responsive to the sun. And when I got to practice, there was no vernacular towards how you make that happen. That was back in the late 80s. And then in the late 90s, I was brought after a maternity leave to come back to my office with Wight and Company to do what turned out to be one of the first pilot projects to receive LEED certification anywhere. We were one of the first 12 pilots, and I was so happy and so inspired by the vocabulary of sustainability that was promulgated by USGBC. I went to the first member summit in 1998 with my project team members, and we said, pick us, we want to be a pilot. And that really ended up being a lightning rod for my career that I never abandoned, and it just has been
That's great when you find something that, it brings out what you wanted to be able to express anyway, right?
Exactly.
I mean, 'cause your interests were there already, but gave you a language, a vehicle for doing that.
Right, and when you're a young designer and you come into this field, if there is no kit of parts and no way forward, you're part of a cog of, this is a team sport, building industry, right? And so the fact that USGBC brought together all these people with similar interests, and that there were no white roofs, there were no dual flush toilets, there was no LED lighting, but all of the innovations that have happened in the 30 years that this has been going on has been really amazing. And so it's having an audience that the building industry can go to put these things in place, made everybody be able to take that step forward.
Right. And so let's flash forward a couple of decades, and you have done 2 passive house buildings.
Yes.
And they don't fit the typical typology for early passive house projects. So can you tell us about both of them?
Yeah, so both of them are located here in Illinois, and they're both activity centers, rec centers. They're for park districts, and we have a very unique grant in the state of Illinois that the first building gave up to $1 million for projects that could achieve net zero energy verification.
Wow, that's great. That's not chump change.
No, it's not. And then they grew it to $2 million because they deemed it wasn't enough to actually pay for the premium, because this grant would pay for not only the solar infrastructure, but also the underlying improvements in efficiency in the underlying building to drive down consumption to make overhead solar possible. So the grant had as its requirement for application to be either Passive House certified or receive certification through ILFI. And I have done both.
Wow, that's great.
And I have to say that doing my first Passive House for the rec center, the first rec center, made me a huge fan of Passive House, because to drive down real energy use in the underlying building is so critical to net zero energy. It's a building block of net zero energy. It's not just about putting solar overhead.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And to watch how a passive house building performs. Because the other thing that's magic about net zero in tandem with passive house is that you have to stick around. You know, I'm a designer. Most of our careers, we get to occupancy, we shake hands with the owner, and we say, we'll see you later. We really hope you love our building. Mm-hmm. But in a passive house, in a net zero energy building, you have a 12-month period that has to prove itself out, which means every month you're watching the building, how it performs. And that means you're getting insight into a lot of things, not just architecture one of them, but mechanical systems, how solar arrays work, how a building owner might change occupancy patterns, all these things that contribute to that performance. And the incredibly beautiful thing about a passive house building is it really delivers on its underlying comfort and efficiency.
Were there any surprises?
The surprise was the 48-hour period in which we turned off the building over a Christmas holiday, and the building only drifted 6 degrees down when it was 10 degrees outside.
And that is such a crucial factor with so many, extreme weather events that we've been having.
Yeah.
It's really, I'm happy to hear about it. And it is one of the characteristics of passive house that I think is undervalued.
Yeah, and they're comfortable. They really are more comfortable. And so to be able to know, like I have in both of my buildings, one building hasn't achieved verification, the other one achieved it in its first 12 months. And they're not that different buildings because they're both made out of precast. They both have super insulation as required. They both have low window to wall ratio, but one had an owner that was really focused and paying attention. And the other, it was their first big building. They didn't have the sophistication of the second owner. And so they didn't know all the nuances of the incredible attention. And we didn't either, to be honest. This was our first net zero energy building. And so unfortunately, these owners were a little bit like the canary in the coal mine, but
so they weren't as attentive to, schedules of maintenance and operations.
Right, and the second one owner was dialed in, really knew how to monitor and modulate the operation, looked at humidity profiles inside, CO2 levels, outside air dampers, all the mechanical things and occupancy schedules, and this owner was really on top of it. But the passive house story is the same across both. Both owners are incredibly grateful and acknowledge how efficient the underlying buildings are for passive house, because passive house is about passive design. It's not about the mechanical systems.
So I have to ask you, do either of the buildings have swimming pools?
No.
Because that is a complicating factor if you're trying to put a swimming pool inside a passive house. It's been done, but it is complicating.
Yeah, these have gym floors, so they have humidification issues in the winter, right? And what I found out is that mechanical systems are designed to keep people comfortable. They're not designed to keep people comfortable at the lowest expenditure of a kBTU. And so there's often these little operating assumptions inside the way the mechanical system is set up that isn't necessarily going to deliver efficiency. And so they're like, this is how much air we're supposed to deliver. This is the time that gas comes on, if gas at a certain temperature, if gas is part of the building. And they are for both of these, even though they're a very minor amount of the overall operating. And so you have to sort of know the mechanical systems really well and know where the buried efficiencies can be in order to modulate the system so that it performs the way it needs to perform to get to net zero energy.
So is your firm doing are they going on to do other recreational facilities? Or
we will do more passive house buildings coming into the future. We have a couple of certified passive house consultants on our staff, and we know a lot about net zero energy. We're actually now doing another building that's pursuing ILFI certification. It's an animal care facility for a forest preserve here, and it's an interesting dilemma because it operates almost like a medical building in that it needs a lot of outside air because of the health of the animals they care for.
Right.
So the energy intensity profile is very different in this building, and that's where the predominant energy is going, not through the envelope.
Right.
So, yeah. But I'm a fan of Passive House.
Well, clearly. Just briefly, can you say what other types of buildings your firm works on?
Sure. So Wight does design and build projects, and we do mostly public sector. So a lot of K-12 schools, a courthouse, lots of facilities for forest preserves, park districts. We do corporate interiors. So our company is about 200 people in engineering and design and construction, and we've been around since 1939.
Well, thank you very much for stopping by, and I hope your keynote presentation really fires people up.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.